Lyra had learned to make herself small. In a world where strength was measured by the ferocity of your wolf and the sharpness of your claws, she had become an expert at disappearing into corners, at dimming the strange silver light that sometimes flickered in her eyes when the visions came. The Riverside pack had no patience for dreamers, and Lyra had been labeled one since she was old enough to speak. While other pups wrestled and hunted, she would freeze mid-step, her eyes glazing over as impossible images flooded her mind. Cities that touched the clouds, wolves with wings of starlight, a world where predator and prey sat together in council, where ancient enemies shared bread and territory. Her parents had been embarrassed. The pack elders had been dismissive. And Alpha Garrett had made it abundantly clear that visionaries had no place in his practical, survival-focused pack. By the time Lyra turned 23, she had perfected the art of silence. She worked in the pack, kitchens, kept her head down, and only allowed herself to sketch the visions in secret, filling notebooks with detailed drawings of the futures that crashed through her consciousness like ocean waves, futures that never came true, futures that everyone insisted were nothing more than the fantasies of a broken mind. She had stopped trying to warn anyone about the dark visions too, the ones that showed blood and betrayal, cities burning and alliances shattering, no one wanted to hear about, disasters that a childish dreamer predicted. No one believed that the strange girl who talked about flying wolves and crystal towers could possibly see anything real. The day Alpha King Theron arrived at Riverside Pack, Lyra was elbow-deep in bread dough, her hair tied back in a messy knot, flour dusting her worn dress. She heard the commotion outside, the sudden nervous energy that rippled through the pack like electricity. The Alpha King rarely left his fortress in the capital, and when he did, it meant inspections, judgments, and often bloodshed for packs that had failed to meet his exacting standards. Theron Blackfang was a legend whispered about in fearful tones, a ruler who had united the fractured wolf territories through sheer brutal force, who showed no mercy to those who challenged his authority, who was said to be able to smell treachery from miles away. Lyra should have stayed in the kitchen, should have kept kneading dough and pretending the world outside didn't exist. But something pulled at her, an insistent tugging in her chest that she had learned never to ignore completely. The visions had been intense all morning, flashing behind her eyelids every time she blinked. A man with eyes like molten gold, a crown that burned with black flames, a future that split into 1,000 different paths, each one dependent on a single moment, a single meeting, a single choice. She found herself walking toward the pack square, drawn by an inevitability she didn't understand. Alpha Garrett stood at attention, his beta and enforcers flanking him in a show of respect and barely concealed anxiety. And there, dismounting from a horse that seemed too large to be natural, was the Alpha King himself. Theron Blackfang was exactly as the stories described, and yet completely different. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and a face that could have been carved from granite, he radiated a power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. But it was his eyes that caught Lyra mid-step, sent her heart hammering against her ribs, gold and ancient, and carrying a weight that spoke of centuries of burden, of decisions that had cost him pieces of his soul, of a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache in sympathy. Their eyes met across the crowded square, and the world stopped. Lyra felt the vision slam into her with the force of an avalanche. She saw him standing in a throne room filled with enemies wearing friendly faces, saw him fighting battles that history would never record, saw him carrying the weight of an entire species on shoulders that were buckling under the pressure. She saw the future he was trying to prevent, the war that would consume everything, the betrayal that was already in motion. And underneath it all, she felt the mate bond snap into place with such intensity that her knees buckled, a golden thread connecting her soul to his in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Theron crossed, the distance between them in seconds, his enforcers scrambling to keep up. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, his power pressing against her skin like a physical thing. He reached out and caught her chin, tilting her face up so he could study her eyes. And Lyra watched his expression shift from curiosity to shock, to something that looked almost like desperate relief. In her eyes, she knew he could see them, the visions that played across her irises like moving pictures. Silver light, dancing in pupils that had always been just slightly wrong, just slightly too reflective, just slightly too aware of things that hadn't happened yet. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion barely held in check, and it sent shivers down her spine despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You're an oracle. A true oracle. Do you have any idea how long I've been searching for you? How many years I've been trying to find someone who could see what's coming, who could help me stop it?" Before everything burns, every muscle in his body was tense with urgency, with the kind of desperate hope that came from someone who had been fighting alone for far too long. Lyra tried to pull away, her heart pounding, her wolf whimpering in confusion at the conflicting instincts raging through her. I don't. Everyone says I'm just a dreamer, that my visions aren't real. I can't help you with anything. I'm nobody important. The words tumbled out in a rush. Years of being dismissed and mocked, making her doubt even the evidence of her own senses, even the visions that had never once failed to show her truth, even if that truth came in symbols and metaphors that no one else wanted to decipher. If you enjoyed this intense opening, make sure to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think Lyra should do. Should she trust the Alpha King? Or is this all a trap? Subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Theron's grip on her chin gentled, but his eyes remained fierce, determined, burning with an intensity that made it clear he had no intention of letting her slip away now that he'd found her. "You are the most important person in this kingdom right now, and you don't even know it." Those visions they mocked, those childish dreams they dismissed, they're prophecies, Oracle. They're the only warning we have about what's coming, and I need you. The kingdom needs you. Will you come with me? Will you let me teach you how to control your gift, how to interpret what you're seeing, how to use it to save everyone you've ever loved? Before Lyra could answer, Alpha Garrett stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed greed. "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean to take her. She's simple-minded, always has been. If you need an oracle, I have others in my pack who might serve better, wolves with actual training and discipline." He was already calculating. Lyra could see it in his eyes, already trying to figure out how to profit from this unexpected development, to offer up someone more valuable in exchange for keeping his pack's reputation intact. Theron didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on Lyra's, and she felt the full weight of his attention, the way he looked at her, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered in the dark. "She is my fated mate, and she is the oracle I've been searching for. No one else will do. Prepare her. Belongings. We leave within the hour." The command was absolute, brooking no argument, and Lyra felt her world tilt on its axis as she realized her entire life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to predict. The journey to the capital took 3 days, and Lyra spent most of it in a daze of shock and confusion. Theron had given her his own horse to ride, had surrounded her with guards who treated her with a deference that felt surreal, had checked on her constantly to ensure she was comfortable, fed, and unharmed. He hadn't touched her beyond that initial meeting, hadn't pressured her or demanded anything, but she could feel his attention on her like sunlight, warm and constant and impossible to ignore. At night, when they made camp, he would sit with her by the fire and ask her about her visions, listening with an intensity that made her nervous and validated in equal measure. "Tell me about the flying wolves," he said on the second night, his voice soft in the darkness, his eyes reflecting the firelight in shades of amber and gold. "What did they look like? How did they move? Every detail matters, Oracle. Every symbol in your visions is a clue to something real, something important." Lyra hesitated, old habits of silence warring with the strange new feeling of being heard, of being taken seriously. They had wings made of starlight and shadow, wings that shifted between solid and ethereal like they existed in multiple dimensions at once. They flew in formations that made patterns in the sky, patterns that looked almost like written language, like they were spelling out messages that I couldn't quite read. And they weren't fighting. That's what always struck me as most impossible. They were flying together, wolves from different territories, different bloodlines, moving as one coordinated whole toward something I couldn't see. Theron leaned forward, his expression intent. The ancient texts speak of a time before the Great Fracture, before we divided into separate packs and territories. They say our ancestors could shift into forms beyond the traditional wolf, that some could take wing, others could command elements, others could walk between worlds. The abilities were lost when we splintered, when we forgot how to trust each other enough to share power. Your visions aren't showing you fantasy, Oracle. They're showing you what we could become again, if we can reunite. If we can remember what we were before fear and greed tore us apart. The capital, city of Ironhold, rose from the mountain like a crown of stone and steel. Massive walls protecting a sprawling metropolis that housed over 100,000 wolves from every territory in the kingdom. Lyra had never seen anything so overwhelming, so impossibly large and complex. The castle at the city's heart was a fortress that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself, all dark stone and soaring towers. Banners bearing the Black Fang symbol of a wolf's head surrounded by black flames flying from every turret. As they rode through the gates, Lyra felt the weight of thousands of eyes on her, whispers following in their wake like ripples in water. Who is she? Why is she riding beside the king? Is that his mate? She looks so ordinary, nothing special about her at all. The comments stung, but Lyra was used to being underestimated, used to being dismissed as unremarkable. What terrified her more was the sudden spike of vision that hit her as they entered the castle courtyard, a flash of betrayal so intense it made her gasp and nearly fall from her horse. She saw a dagger dripping with poison, a council room filled with wolves wearing masks of loyalty, while their hearts burned with treason. A future where Theron lay bleeding on cold stone, while someone he trusted stood over him with blood on their hands. Theron was beside her in an instant, catching her before she could fall, his strong arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. "Easy, Oracle. I've got you. What did you see?" His voice was calm but urgent, and Lyra realized he'd been waiting for this, expecting her visions to reveal the threats he'd been hunting. "Betrayal," she whispered, clinging to him as the images continued to flash behind her eyes. "So much betrayal. People you trust, people close to you. They're planning something terrible, and they're hiding it behind smiles and false loyalty. I can't see faces clearly, but I can feel their intentions. They want you dead, and they want it to look like an accident, like a natural death, so the kingdom doesn't revolt." Theron's arms tightened around her briefly before he carefully set her on her feet, his hands steadying her while his eyes scanned the assembled crowd with new wariness. "Then we have work to do, Oracle, and we need to move quickly. Come, let me show you your new home. Let me introduce you to the few people I still trust, and then you're going to help me figure out which of my advisors are planning to put a knife in my back." The royal suite Theron led her to was larger than her family's entire house had been, all rich fabrics and polished wood and windows that overlooked the entire city. A team of attendants appeared immediately, offering food and hot baths and beautiful dresses that Lyra stared at in disbelief. But Theron dismissed them all with a wave, leaving just the two of them in the opulent space. And suddenly the reality of her situation came crashing down. She was alone. With the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, the male-the mate bond insisted was hers, in rooms that were clearly meant to be shared, and she had no idea what he expected from her. Theron must have sensed her panic because he immediately put space between them, moving to stand by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, in a deliberate show of non-aggression. "I know this is overwhelming. I know I essentially kidnapped you from your pack, gave you no choice, no time to prepare. That's not how I wanted this to happen, Oracle. I wanted to court you properly, to give you time to decide if you could accept me as your mate. But we don't have time. The conspiracy I've been tracking is accelerating. And without your visions to guide me, I've been fighting blind for months. I need your help. The kingdom needs your help. But I will never force you into the mate bond. That choice is always yours, no matter what fate has decided." Lyra turned to look at him, really look at him. And for the First time she allowed herself to see past the fearsome reputation to the male beneath. He looked exhausted, she realized. Exhausted in a way that went bone deep, that spoke of years of carrying impossible burdens alone. His shoulders were tight with tension that never seemed to ease. His eyes haunted by decisions that had cost him more than anyone knew. His hands scarred from battles both literal and political. He was exactly what her visions had shown her, a king drowning under the weight of his crown, desperate for help, but too proud or too isolated to ask for it until necessity forced his hand. "Why me?" she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him at the window, looking out over a city that now depended on her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You're the Alpha King. You could have anyone. Why does it have to be me, the broken dreamer that everyone mocks? What if I'm not actually an oracle? What if everyone was right and I'm just delusional and you've pinned all your hopes on someone who can't actually help you?" Theron turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch, made her wolf whine with longing for a connection she'd been taught to suppress. "Because when I look into your eyes, I see the truth. I see centuries of suppressed oracle bloodline finally manifesting. I see power that terrifies you because no one taught you how to wield it. I see the future of this kingdom written in silver light. And because you're my mate, which means fate itself decided we're stronger together than apart. I don't need perfect oracle. I need genuine. I need someone who sees the truth even when it's uncomfortable, who dreams of better futures even when everyone says those dreams are impossible. I need you, exactly as you are. If this story is capturing your heart, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment telling me your predictions about who the traitors might be. The next morning, Theron introduced Lyra to his inner circle during a private breakfast meeting. Commander Cade was a grizzled warrior with scars covering half his face and eyes that had seen too many battles, but he greeted Lyra with surprising gentleness and immediate acceptance of her role. Lady Iris was Theron's chief advisor on domestic affairs, a sharp-minded older woman who had served his father before him, and who studied Lyra with calculating interest that felt more curious than hostile. And then there was Theron's younger sister, Princess Mara, who bounded into the room like an excited puppy, and immediately declared that she'd been begging for a sister for years, and fate had finally delivered. Mara was everything Lyra wasn't, confident and beautiful and comfortable in her own skin. But instead of the jealousy or dismissal Lyra had learned to expect from popular wolves, Mara treated her like the most fascinating person she'd ever met. An oracle. A real oracle. Do you know how rare you are? There hasn't been a confirmed oracle in the kingdom for over 1,000 years. Everyone thought the bloodline was extinct. You're basically magical royalty, and you've been hiding in some backwater pack baking bread? That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard. Theron, you found yourself a heroine. Don't mess this up. Despite the warmth of this small group, Lyra could feel the undercurrents of danger that flowed through the castle like poison in water. Later that day, Theron took her to observe a full council meeting, seating her beside his throne in a position of honor that made several council members' eyes narrow with barely concealed hostility. Lord Vance, the master of coin, smiled at her with too many teeth and asked intrusive questions about her background that felt designed to undermine her credibility. Duke Corrigan, who controlled the Eastern Territories, openly scoffed when Theron introduced her as his mate and oracle, suggesting that the king had been fooled by a clever opportunist. And High Priestess Selene, who was supposed to be the kingdom's spiritual advisor, looked at Lyra with such cold calculation that it made her skin crawl. But it was Master Aldrich, Theron's chief strategist, and the man who had served as his mentor since childhood, who made Lyra's visions flare with warning. He was perfectly polite, perfectly supportive, praising Theron's wisdom in bringing an oracle to court and offering to help train Lyra in interpreting her visions. But when Lyra looked at him, she saw shadows that clung to him like oil, saw futures where his smiling face was the last thing Theron saw before darkness claimed him. The vision was so intense that she gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles white, fighting to stay present while images of betrayal crashed through her consciousness. Theron noticed immediately, his hand finding hers in a gesture of support and silent question. "Later," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Tell me later, when we're alone and secure. For now, breathe through it. I'm here. You're safe." That night, in the security of their shared suite with magical wards that Theron activated to prevent eavesdropping, Lyra told him everything she'd seen. Theron listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail, his hands clenching into fists as she described the vision of Aldrich standing over his dead body. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal of learning that the man who had raised him, who he'd trusted above all others, was planning his murder. "Aldrich has been with my family for 40 years. He was my father's best friend. He taught me everything I know about strategy, about ruling, about separating emotion from necessary decisions. If he's the traitor, then I need proof. Absolute, undeniable proof. Because if I move against him without it, I'll tear the council apart. Half of them are loyal to him, would follow him into rebellion if I accused him without evidence. Your visions are truth, Oracle, but we need to make others see that truth. And that means catching him in the act." Over the following weeks, Lyra worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. Theron brought in ancient texts about Oracle training, rare manuscripts that describe techniques for controlling and directing visions instead of being overwhelmed by them. Lady Iris taught her the subtle arts of court politics, how to read the unspoken, currents that flowed beneath polite conversation, how to identify allies and enemies by the things they didn't say. Commander Cade gave her basic combat training, insisting that an oracle who couldn't defend herself was a liability, pushing her until her muscles screamed but her confidence grew. And Mara became her unexpected best friend, the sister she'd never had, helping her navigate the social complexities of court, while making her laugh during the rare moments when the weight of prophecy wasn't crushing her. But it was the time with Theron that transformed her most profoundly. Every evening he would sit with her and ask about her visions, helping her untangle the symbolic language of prophecy, teaching her to trust her instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. He shared the burden of leadership with her, explaining the complex political situations he was navigating, the difficult decisions he had to make, the constant balancing act between justice and mercy, between protecting his people and respecting their autonomy. He was nothing like the brutal tyrant the rumors painted him as. He was thoughtful and careful, agonizing over every choice that might cause harm, carrying the weight of every life lost under his rule, like personal failures. And slowly, carefully, the mate bond between them began to strengthen, not through physical intimacy, but through the deeper connection of two souls, learning to trust each other, to depend on each other, to fight for each other. Theron never pushed for more than she was ready to give, but his care for her was evident in 1,000 small ways. The way he always positioned himself between her and potential threats, the way he learned her preferences for tea and made sure her favorite blend was always available, the way he listened to her opinions with genuine respect, often implementing her suggestions even when they contradicted his own instincts, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his kingdom, like losing her would break something in him that could never be repaired. 2 months after her arrival, Lyra's visions finally gave them the opening they needed. She saw a midnight meeting in the old archives, saw Aldrich and High Priestess Selene exchanging documents and poison, heard fragments of their conspiracy to weaken Theron through slow-acting toxins, while simultaneously undermining his authority with rumors and political manipulation. They planned to make him appear paranoid and unstable, then stage a coup that would look like a concerned council removing a tyrant for the good of the kingdom. Theron organized a trap with meticulous precision, positioning trusted guards in hidden locations throughout the archives, setting up magical recording crystals that would capture both visual and auditory evidence of the betrayal. On the appointed night, Lyra accompanied him despite his protests that it was too dangerous, her visions guiding them through the castle's secret passages to a vantage point where they could observe without being detected. Watching Aldrich betray Theron was one of the most painful things Lyra had ever witnessed. The older man spoke of Theron with contempt and cold calculation, calling him soft, too merciful, too concerned with fairness, when what the kingdom needed was iron-fisted control and expansion through conquest. He revealed that he'd been poisoning Theron for months, with substances designed to cloud his judgment and weaken his wolf, preparing for the moment when the king would be vulnerable enough to eliminate. High Priestess Selene laughed as she described how she'd been manipulating oracle prophecies for years, spreading false visions that supported their agenda while dismissing any genuine prophetic warnings that might expose them. Theron's pain was a physical thing, radiating from him in waves that made Lyra's heart ache. She reached for his hand in the darkness, lacing her fingers through his in silent support, and felt him grip her tightly, anchoring himself to her presence as his world shattered around him. When Aldrich mentioned that the final phase of their plan involved killing Lyra to prevent her visions from revealing their conspiracy, Theron's control snapped. He emerged from their hiding spot like an avenging angel, his power exploding through the archive in a wave of barely controlled fury. The confrontation was brutal and swift. Aldrich tried to fight, tried to justify his betrayal, with claims that he was saving the kingdom from a weak king who would lead them to ruin. But faced with magical recordings that captured every word, with evidence of poison and conspiracy that could not be denied, his defense crumbled. High Priestess Selene attempted to flee, and was caught by Commander Cade, who had been waiting with guards to seal every exit. By dawn, both traitors were in the dungeons, and the council had been summoned for an emergency session where the evidence of their treachery would be presented. The trial lasted 3 days, and resulted in a purge that rocked the kingdom to its foundations. 7 council members were found to be complicit in the conspiracy, their betrayal driven by ambition and greed, and the belief that Theron's progressive policies were weakening traditional power structures. The executions were public and necessary, a message that treason against the crown would not be tolerated. But Lyra watched Theron carry out justice with a heavy heart, saw how each death cost him despite their guilt, how the weight of necessary violence added to the burden he already carried. In the aftermath, Theron began the work of rebuilding his council with wolves chosen for their integrity, rather than their political connections. He implemented new oversight systems designed to prevent future conspiracies, established independent bodies to investigate corruption, created protections for whistleblowers who reported abuses of power, and he publicly declared Lyra as his queen and oracle, elevating her to a position where her visions would guide kingdom policy, where her insights would be valued and recorded for future generations. The mating ceremony took place on the first day of spring, 6 months after Lyra's arrival at court. Unlike the political marriages common among royalty, theirs was a celebration of genuine partnership, of 2 souls who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to face the future together. Mara cried through the entire ceremony, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. Lady Iris smiled with quiet satisfaction, having watched their relationship develop from wary alliance into deep love, and Commander Cade stood guard with obvious pride, having appointed himself as Lyra's personal protector and mentor. When Theron and Lyra completed their mate bond that night, the joining of Oracle and King, it triggered something unprecedented in the kingdom's history. Power surged through both of them, ancient abilities awakening in response to their union, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Theron's wolf began to shift into something more. Wings of shadow and starlight erupted from his back, exactly as Lyra had seen in her childhood visions, and she understood with sudden clarity that her prophecies had never been about some distant future. They had been about this, about what they could build together, about the transformation that their partnership would spark throughout the entire kingdom. Before we get to the incredible conclusion, let me know in the comments what supernatural ability you think Lyra might develop. And if you're loving this journey, subscribing really helps this channel grow and brings more amazing stories your way. The years that followed were marked by profound transformation. Lyra established the Oracle Academy, a school where wolves with prophetic abilities could learn to control and understand their gifts, instead of being dismissed as delusional dreamers. She traveled throughout the kingdom, identifying and recruiting young oracles who had been hiding their talents, giving them the training and validation she'd never received. Within 3 years, The kingdom had a network of seers who could provide early warning about natural disasters, economic shifts, and potential conflicts, allowing Theron to govern proactively rather than reactively. But it was Lyra's greatest vision, the one that came to her during the birth of her and Theron's first child, that changed everything. She saw the path to reuniting the fractured supernatural world, saw how the ancient abilities could be reawakened through intentional cooperation and trust between different species. She saw wolves learning to take wing, vampires rediscovering their connection to elemental magic, fae remembering how to shape reality itself, witches channeling power that had been locked away for millennia, and at the center of it all, she saw her daughter, a child born of Oracle and King, who would become the bridge between all supernatural species, the catalyst for the new age. Theron listened to her vision with the same intense focus he'd shown that first night by the campfire, and then he began the delicate work of diplomacy that would lay the groundwork for the future she'd seen. He reached out to other supernatural leaders, proposing alliances based on mutual benefit and shared knowledge rather than conquest and domination. He opened the kingdom's borders to refugees from other realms, creating safe havens where different species could interact peacefully. He established the first interspecies council, giving voice to perspectives that had been silenced for centuries. The resistance was fierce. Many wolves clung to traditions of isolation and supremacy, unwilling to share power or territory with beings they'd been taught to view as lesser or enemy. Assassination attempts on both Lyra and Theron became routine enough that Mara joked about keeping a tally. Political factions tried repeatedly to undermine the progressive reforms, to paint the king and queen as traitors to their own kind. But slowly, painfully, things began to change. Young wolves who had grown up hearing Lyra's prophecies, who had trained at her academy, who had seen the evidence of what cooperation could achieve, began to outnumber the old guard. And when the first wolf successfully manifested wings, exactly as the oracle had predicted, it sparked a renaissance that couldn't be stopped. On the 10th anniversary of Lyra becoming queen, she stood on the castle balcony beside Theron, watching as their 3 children played in the courtyard below. Their eldest daughter Arya was practicing flight, under Mara's enthusiastic instruction, her small wings of silver light carrying her higher with each attempt. Their twin sons were engaged in a wrestling match that kept shifting between wolf and winged forms, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. And in Lyra's arms, their youngest daughter slept peacefully, already showing signs of the oracle gift in the way her eyes sometimes reflected visions even in dreams. The city beyond the castle walls had transformed as well. Crystal towers were beginning to rise alongside the traditional stone structures, exactly as Lyra had drawn in her childhood notebooks. Wolves from every territory mingled freely in the markets and streets, no longer divided by the old clan rivalries. And in the skies above, winged wolves flew in formation, their movements spelling out messages of unity and hope. The ancient language of power relearned and reclaimed by a generation that refused to let fear dictate their potential. Theron wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close, his own wings of shadow manifesting briefly in a gesture of contentment. "Do you remember when I first found you? When you were convinced you were just a delusional dreamer that no one would ever believe? Look at what your childish dreams have built. Oracle, look at the future you dared to imagine when everyone said it was impossible." Lyra leaned into him, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her from mockery to mastery, from isolation to belonging, from doubt to absolute certainty in her purpose. "I remember being terrified. I remember thinking you were making a terrible mistake, putting your faith in someone broken. But you taught me that I was never broken, just unfinished. You taught me that the dreams everyone mocked were the most important gift I had to offer. You gave me the courage to believe in my own visions, and you gave me hope when I had none left." Theron replied softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You showed me that the brutal path I'd been walking, the isolation I'd accepted as necessary, was actually leading me toward destruction. You taught me that strength isn't about ruling through fear. It's about building something worth protecting. Every day with you is a gift I never thought I'd deserve. And every vision you share shapes us into something better than we were." Their daughter Arya called up to them from the courtyard, her voice bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa, watch this. I can almost reach the tower." And then she was soaring upward, her wings carrying her higher than she'd ever managed before, sunlight streaming through the translucent membranes and casting rainbow shadows on the stones below. Lyra felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her daughter embody the prophecy that everyone had once mocked, as she witnessed the impossible becoming reality through the courage of those willing to dream beyond the limitations of what had always been. As the sun set over Ironhold, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lyra allowed herself one final vision, a glimpse of the distant future that awaited. She saw her great-great-grandchildren standing in a world where the barriers between supernatural species had dissolved completely, where flying wolves were as common as traditional ones, where oracles were valued as the treasures they'd always been, where peace was no longer a childish dream, but a hard-won reality, maintained through constant effort and unwavering commitment to cooperation. She saw Theron's legacy not as a conqueror, but as a unifier, not as a tyrant, but as the king who had the courage to change, when changing was the hardest thing he could do. And she saw herself, remembered not as the strange girl who everyone had mocked, but as the Oracle Queen who had dared to dream impossible dreams and then spent her life making them real. The future was never certain, never guaranteed, always dependent on the choices made in each present moment, but it was also infinitely malleable, shaped by those brave enough to envision something better and stubborn enough to fight for that vision, even when everyone said it couldn't be done. Theron's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of a decade spent learning each other's rhythms, each other's needs, each other's dreams. Together, they had built something that would outlast them, something that would ripple through generations, transforming the supernatural world from a place of fear and division into one of wonder and unity. And it had all started with one moment, one meeting, one king who saw the future dancing in a dreamer's eyes and chose to believe in the impossible. The end of this story marks the beginning of their greatest legacy, a future where childish dreams become the blueprints for reality, where mocked visions transform into prophecies fulfilled, where love between two unlikely souls sparks a revolution that changes everything. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share your own dreams in the comments below, the ones people said were impossible, because maybe they're not dreams at all. Maybe they're prophecies waiting for someone brave enough to believe in them. Thank you for being part of this journey, and I'll see you in the next story, where more impossible loves and supernatural adventures await.